We've got this nice little petri dish here called Gangplank. That's kind of a social experiment for where innovation happens. And as part of that, I've started to be able to make some observations, and I've been surrounded by enough smart people to start asking questions of them and start to make deductions about perhaps where we're going in the future as a society and as a system, and what that means to future innovation and to what's important. And so as part of that, I thought, well, why would the Tech Council be interested in something like this, right? Like, I like to pontificate about this kind of things, and as guys tease me around here, whether they call me Socrates or whatever, I like to sit here and just talk about big ideas. But what value do those ideas necessarily have to what you do in your daily life and what you do for your occupation? And one of the things, I'm a voracious reader. I love to read anything and get my hands on, whether it be journals or budget manuals or you name it. I don't care. I just constantly like to be reading if I'm not talking, which isn't a whole lot, I guess, if you come around me and see me talk. And so as part of that, one of the things I saw an IBM study, and it really struck me as odd for a number of reasons. They took basically Fortune 200, Fortune 250 companies, if I remember right. This is the big of the big. And they asked their CEOs what they were looking for in their management team. Okay? And there's a list of about 40 things came back from that study, maybe 30 things. The only thing that more than half of the CEOs agreed on, and roughly 60% of them agreed upon, was that creativity was the most important leadership skill of their future management team. Now, the reason that this just blew me away wasn't that I don't think that creativity is really important, but when I look at the Fortune 200 companies of the world, I don't see them as being very creative things, very creative thinkers, and producing creative leadership out of their organizations. And so it's funny that why we see that deficiency. I was just assuming they were too stupid, too monolithic, too non-obvious to understand that they were missing this skill set. But here their CEOs blanketly said, look, this is what we're missing. But what really got me was that the next item on the list only had like 18% consensus, and it was, I don't even remember what it was, but it was a kind of standard trustworthiness or something similar to that. And, only 10% of them said that integrity was important. And so what that really told me is, we weren't talking that, 45 or 50% of them wanted this and 55% wanted creativity. I mean, the gap between creativity and the next item was so big that what that told me is that companies today are dying, literally dying, because of a lack of creativity. And when I look at our educational system, when I look at the way that we structure the place that we work and how we treat people, it's no wonder that we don't have any creativity stemming from these organizations. Because we do everything humanly possible to beat creativity out of kids the minute that they enter kindergarten. We do everything in the way we manage people, the way we set up our environments, to stymie creativity. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit about how we can potentially start to change that and how we can start to unlock creativity in the organizations and the systems that we work in. So we're rolling in kind of a revolution, right? Like we talk, I hear a lot of the 20-somethings and the millennials really talking about their great uprising, right? Their great spirit of revolution. And I think that every generation has their sense of revolution and has their sense of we're taking our identity and we're taking our ideals and we're sticking it to the man, right? Or the woman, as it might be now in a progressive society. And, when I look at it, a lot of it is around the social revolution, right? When we look at the ways people are communicating, the ways that they're starting to relate to one another, there's this greater connectivity, right? So one of the things that the internet has kind of produced for us is a way for us to connect with people around the world that have similar interests to us in real time with very minimal barrier to entry and connect very rapidly. So those of us that are a little bit older might find this disturbing. We might find this confusing. We might find it difficult to deal with. But when we look at a younger age group, their transparency is so much higher. Right? That they share so much more information. It's second nature to them, where somebody from my generation might say, yeah, I want to share that information, but what's somebody going to do with it? I'm worried about this. What about fraud? What about this? The generation underneath says, I don't really care, because the value that I get back from that exposure or that transparency is much, much greater than what I get by hiding information or making myself opaque to the world. And so we kind of have this whole revolution kind of starting, and I think you kind of saw it come to a head, or saw the power of it at least, and this is a revolution that can be a real world revolution, and what we saw in Egypt. I mean, if you really look at, if you guys, I really encourage you to go read. This is they basically transformed a city in a number of days with limited means of communication through connections. They were able to basically set up a city within inside of a city within a square that served thousands of people, and were able to overthrow the government that they knew. Pretty powerful stuff. I mean, I call that real revolution. This isn't just, hey, we've got some ideals, but the principles and the inner workings of this social revolution is powerful enough to push entire governments over. Right? So it's something that can't be ignored. Something that's very real, very powerful. And I think that that's why those CEOs said, we want creativity more than anything, because they understand that being able to tap into creativity and unlock that is powerful enough to overthrow a government. Okay? If I'm Ford Motor Company, I want to have that kind of power within my walls. If I'm GE, I want to have that kind of power within my walls. And I'm scared of somebody else wielding that power against me, my competitor. But what we don't see, and what we're not talking about enough, at least not in the mainstream, is that I really feel that it's more than just social connection. Right? We've had an entire industrial revolution. We've had an entire secondary revolution on top of that has started to separate us from each other. Right? We've built suburbs. We've built almost every structure we've built because of the car, because of roads. We've started to isolate ourselves. And so for the last 30 or 40 years, we've really created social structures where we don't interact nearly as much as we used to. And I think that people have this innate craving and this innate longing and sense of wanting to belong. And I think if you read any psychology book, I think that's fairly well-known fact that people long for that, but we've disconnected. And so I think what's starting to happen is that through technology, we've started to intersect with people again, and we started to meet people again, and we started to become transparent again, and we started to mingle again. But we're kind of figuring it out with, okay, those are surface level connections. How do we start to make those connections a little bit deeper? How do we start to make them a little bit more meaningful? And what I'm really talking about is, how do we start to allow trust into the equation? How do we allow ourselves to start to become vulnerable with other people so that the magic can really happen? And I think that that's part of the revolution that's coming next. Because I think you're going to see a younger generation that is starting to become more and more vulnerable with each other. They're starting to trust each other a lot more, which allows an acceleration of ideas. Okay? Because ideas can't live by themselves. Ideas have to be around other ideas to survive. They need other input in order to breathe. And because of this, you have to be willing to share your ideas. And if you can't be vulnerable and you can't trust, you're not going to share. And so I think we've started to create an entire society or entire ecosystem with the millennials that sharing is at the root of who they are. It's no longer an effort for them to share. It's part of who they are. And I think it's important that we talk about that, because I think that that pushes us into a whole new world. Right? Not to be too cliche, but really as a species, I think it starts to push us into a whole new world. We talk about self-organization, self-organizing teams. We talk about emergent culture. Right? We talk about things that are starting to push the bounds of what we can do independently and start to push the bounds towards what we can do collectively. And I think anytime you see a big bump in some kind of technology, whether it be every 70 years, every 150 years, depends on which historians you talk to, what their time frame is, you generally start to see a little bit of a renaissance. And usually that renaissance is because you come to a time where it's become so bleak and so dark and so dimming that people start to unite together to kind of revolt against it. When they do that, they start to have shared experience, they start to self-organize, they start to dig deeper, they start to tap into their creativity, and they really start to push innovation forward, and they really start to move. What excites me is we're so connected now. And if you think about when the United States, the American Revolution, and you think about all of the ideas and Thomas Edison and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and the amount of innovation that came in a very short time by a very small number of connected people, think of all the barriers they had to be able to connect with each other. Think if they lived 5 miles apart, the hardship that it took for them to be able to meet on a regular basis if they had a radius of 30 miles. They didn't have a car. We can in real time communicate with other people and collaborate with them around the world in real time today. Okay, so I'm excited about this next evolution of innovation and what's going to come out of it. And I think that if we can learn to unlock it and take advantage of it, we've got an ability to propel ourselves forwards in ways that we can't even fathom right now today. And so kind of going to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, one of the things that I think that we've started to do is, I think in each one of the revolutions that has kind of happened over the last 1,000 years, we've started to kind of move up this food chain one step at a time, right? So, we used to, if we were hunters and gatherers or we were unenlightened, a majority of the population in any given space was really fighting for food and shelter. And they're really at the bottom barrel of this, how do I fight off scurvy, right? Like, how do I live to be past 20? How do I live to, most people didn't even live to see their grandkids, right? In safety, we started to build cities, we started to build, have government structure that was a little bit more humane, a little bit more idealized. We kind of went through a whole period of kind of working that out. And then we kind of, had the hippies in the 60s, right? A little bit more of the love and belonging and push into this. And I think we kind of had some esteem, we have no losers. We're trying to really make sure everybody feels good about themselves. But I think we've got to a point, at least in this country, and it's certainly not necessarily worldwide, but in a lot of countries, we've really gotten to a point where at least the people in the technology space or in the knowledge worker space, the creative class, whatever you want to call it, we've really got to a point where the things on the top of this pyramid are what are driving them. Right? And this is why you hear like Dan Pink, a number of people talk about what motivates people. Right? You can only motivate salary-wise to a certain level, and then you have to start to unlock intrinsic motivation. And I think a lot of this is people that are high functioning, they're not really cared as long as they got their base needs met. And after a certain level, they want to change the world. They want to have an impact. They want to do things that matter to them. So I think it's important that we understand that we're looking at organizational structures. So it's not all about money. Right? Wall Street's all about money, right? Look where that got us. Right? Pretty big success, right? We're all pretty happy with that outcome. Right? So what I want to talk to you today about is how do we unlock that? Right? How do we start to unlock that kind of innovation and that kind of creativity in the organizations that we work in today? And those could be the organizations that we work in, and those could be the organizations we work with. Right? So here's a little bit of our thesis. So our thesis that we've kind of come up with, a number of us talking here, is that it really all starts with chaos. Right? Without the right amount of chaos, there's no creativity. Right? If you're not getting mentally stimulated on a regular basis, your brain is not going to be producing ideas. You have to have stimuli in order to have thoughts. Right? If you just stood in this pure white room and sat there for 20 hours, you'd probably have some thoughts. You'd be able to brainstorm pretty quick for the first day, 2 days, 3 days. But after a while, your number of thoughts would go down dramatically. Right? If you go out and you've got all sorts of interaction coming at you, all sorts of stimuli, and you sit down and you start to think, you have a whole lot more of information. Now, the thing that I think is important, a minor distinction here, is I think to process ideas, you probably need to not have chaos. But in order to have ideas, you have to be exposed to some chaos, right? And out of that chaos, your gears start turning. You start thinking. You start to have some ideas. You start to tap into your creativity. You start to say, how do I solve this problem? And you really start to basically dig down into this. So I was reading something the other day, and I thought it was a great example of somebody who kind of got the gears working, a little bit of how kind of chaos is involved, and moving through a chain, and how somebody's progression of ideas works, right? And then it's about collaboration. It's about taking that idea and sharing that idea with somebody and saying, hey, I'm thinking about this, right? And I think Stephen Johnson likes to call them hunches, right? You have a hunch. And with that little hunch, you share that hunch with somebody else, and they probably have a hunch. And maybe your two hunches together start to form an idea. And then that idea grows, and the more you share it, the better and more refined that idea comes, right? And then we say at the end of that, really when you start to change the world or you start to monetize it, you have innovation on the other side. So we say that you have to have some creativity, you have to have some chaos to spark creativity, to spark ideas, to spark hunches. You have to share that information with other people. You have to collaborate with them. You have to use building blocks and build on top of it, right? And at some point, you're able to turn that into an innovation. Now, most people think that timeline is a number of weeks. I think most innovation timelines are a number in terms of a decade or a year. Not a matter of days, not a matter of weeks, not a matter of months, but you're talking a year to a decade. Does it take most ideas to really come all the way through fruition? Right? A lot of times people will carry an idea around with them for 2-3 years before they really start sharing it. And it takes another 3 or 4 years of really sharing it before it starts to have meat, and another year or two before they're actually able to turn it into something that the world can consume. Okay? And then lastly, we like to say that you need to sandwich that with equal parts of fun and equal parts of excellence. Right? Because I think, I like to say fun is the lubricant to good ideas. Right? I don't see a whole lot of people who are completely serious all the time that really do a good job of playing with ideas. And I think that that's part of the lubricant, the creativity, is to try things that everybody else laughs at, that seem insane, that everybody else hasn't tried before. And
can you define fun? Like, is that just goofing off?
Yeah, it's totally goofing off, like the stuff that your boss gets really pissed about. No, I would define fun kind of as more of a shared experience. In the sense of, I think that the thing that, in my observation, the number one thing that fun does is it exposes vulnerability. And when you're vulnerable with other people, you do a much better job of sharing your ideas with them. And you do a much better job of saying, I know this sounds really crazy, but I was thinking, what if? Right? If you don't feel comfortable with somebody, you don't say what do you think of this? Right? What about this? You don't do that if you don't feel comfortable with them. And so what fun starts to do is it adds that levity that's necessary to basically say, like, okay, we're kind of all in a good mood. It opens that door for kind of the impossible to happen, right? And then I think on the other side is excellence, right? And that's kind of the counterweight to that is, to really bring things all the way through, it's really about saying, how can we do this the best possible, right? Like, I almost think of it as chaos is the big part of the funnel, right, where anything goes, right? It's kind of the brainstorming, like anything goes, and the closer you get towards innovation, the more refined or the more focused and the more driven that comes. So, I mean, a really great idea that doesn't have any excellence behind it, doesn't have any drive behind it, generally is never going to make it to market. And so you have to have a little bit of all the characteristics. And I think that the interesting thing and why collaboration is important is more often than not, one person is strong at one side of this or the other, top or the bottom or the other, and it's really important that you build teams that have a little bit of all of this baked in. You might have somebody who's a really great idea person, but they're totally unreliable to bring things to fruition. Right? You might have somebody else that's really, really super serious and wants, top quality and really bring things to market, but they aren't real fun to be around all the time. And you might have another person that they're just kind of a comic relief. Everybody loves to be around them, but nobody really can point the finger on what value they have. And I think it was People Where, by Tom Lister, I think it had a good kind of bit on this. is, they did a number of studies for teams, software teams in particular, and they found it odd that when they would do these reviews, that there were a number of people that, when they interviewed them, virtually every single person in the company said, I want that person on my team. But when they said, well, what does that person do for your team, nobody could answer what that person did with the team. And so when they really kind of got to the meat of it, the thing was, well, all I know is that every time that person's on somebody's team, the team is successful. So they're a common denominator for a successful team, even though we don't know what they do. Right? Which is just crazy, right? I mean, I think that's part of the problem with our organizations, is we say, what's your job title, what's your certification, exactly what you do, not how do you fit into this team, right? So, I kind of want to give some visual examples of, it's a little green here, I thought, of what some of this means, right? So if I were to talk about chaos, right, and this, I'm actually from a smaller town in Missouri, so I'm not beating up on anybody by saying, if this is a small rural town, right, the amount of stimuli is pretty low, right? Pretty hard to necessarily be inspired on a regular basis now. The wonders of God are great, and you probably get some great sunsets and some tornadoes and different things. This certainly can spark the imagination, but on a whole, the amount of stimuli is pretty low. You're interacting with the same people on a regular basis. Everybody's kind of got their routine. Everybody's got their boundaries. Everybody's got their structure, and there's probably not a whole lot of interaction going on to really spark my idea. So, right, I might be getting a little bit hunchy here and there, but I'm probably not rattling off everywhere I go. And actually, before I go, I want to go back to this. Well, remind me to give you a sample, kind of cradle to grave at the end. Opposed to living in a place like this. It's just vibrant all the time, 24/7. There's always something going on. There's always new people you're bumping into, whether they be visitors or residents. If you tried to meet everybody in this location, you couldn't do it. And I think that some of the data is starting to play out to that. Okay? We call these mega regions. Okay? A lot of the economists out there are talking a lot about the data on this. When we look, there's 7 or 8 mega regions in the world. Okay? And when I say mega region, these are generally multiple cities so clustered together you can't tell where they begin and where they end. If you were to start in Boston and go to New York to Philly, it's hard to tell. It's just like being in Phoenix. You can't tell kind of where it begins, ends. There's something all along. You've got train connectivity. You've got the ability to bounce between those cities pretty flawlessly. And these are cities that have 20, 30, 40 million people collectively in them. And so you look at those centers of innovation, and they're actually creating something like 90% of the GDP for the world. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. If you look at the number of degrees or education, most of the educated people are in these clusters. And I don't think that's not without a reason. I think it's because educated people with ideas want to be around other educated people with ideas because they want to see progress. And they know that they have to be motivated, and they know that they have to be inspired, and they know they have to share their ideas to make them happen. And so that the young people in this country are gravitating towards our coasts, generally to the north. And it's only going to get worse. It's only going to increase. Because the amount of wealth generated in those segments is far outpacing the wealth of not in those places. I think it's important as we understand as organizations. If you're in HR and marketing and you're saying, how do we get good people? How do we get the right customers? Good luck. If you're here, good luck competing against here. Right? And so how do we start to create organizations that start to look more like that provide that chaos? Maybe we're not able to do an entire city like that. The thing is, Arizonans, we have to ask ourselves that. It's the reason why we're in the bottom of the gutter when it comes to economic development. We've built cities. We're the biggest small city in the world. I say that all the time. We're the biggest small city in the world. All right, so creativity, right? Plain, simple, idealistic, nice, everybody's happy, let's play it safe, versus a little bit edgy, right? I think that a big part of creativity comes with a bit of boldness. And at Gangplank, we kind of deemed it as be dangerous. Right? And the idea behind that is don't settle for the status quo. If you want to innovate, you have to take risks. You have to push your creativity. You have to say, okay, this looks really great, but how could it be better? How could it be worse? How could it be different? You have to tap into that. You have to start asking the questions. You have to start observing the things around you. Right? All right, now this is the part where I'll probably completely offend you, and I apologize in advance for that. Collaboration. Does this look like a place of great collaboration? Probably not. But it probably looks like 90% of our workplaces. Right? We literally put people in boxes and get frustrated that they don't have good ideas, that they have low morale, and that they don't have the company at heart. I don't know about you, but when I put my dog in the cage, he's happy for about the first 5 minutes because his food bowl happens to be in there, and then the rest of the time he kind of looks at me like, what did I do wrong? Okay. We do this to employees. We do this to friends. We do this to colleagues. Just look at the structure from everything's monotone. It's the same color. There's no visibility. Short of a few little kind of window portals here. How are we providing the chaos to be inspired to do anything? And when we are inspired, how do we share? How do we share with each other what we're thinking about? Our best bet's maybe the water cooler, right? Maybe maybe a meeting, right? Opposed to, an open space. It's got a little bit of chaotic environment around it, right? It's got a number of, people in really close proximity. And I think that this is one of the greatest observations I've really noticed in running Gangplank is because we've been short on space, we've started to push people tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter as sardines. And, at first, I felt really horrible about that. And I still struggle with it today. Is it the right thing? Like I said, I don't have the answers. But I'll tell you what, the interactions are amazing. The interactions between people are completely different when they're exposed and when they're forced to be vulnerable. And there's not this space where this is my space and this is my little box and this is my little house, and when I go into it, I shut the door and I shut you out, and that you're made to be a little bit more open. And it's amazing the amount of things that happen from conversation to conversation. You can literally see ideas spark from across the room where somebody starts talking about something to somebody else, and somebody halfway across the room says something back and joins in a conversation, and then somebody from the other side of the room gets up, and pretty soon everybody's migrating back to the room with a whiteboard and having a conversation. Right? It's amazing. And it just can't happen when there's walls. It just can't. Even when you want it to, you just can't. Right? So, how do we start to unleash that? Right? How do we get to the point where we're unlocking that energy? Right? And I think that it really goes to the easiest way to unlock creativity is setting a good environment and trusting people to do the right thing. I think when you've got good people and good ideas, the best thing you can do is get out of the way. Absolutely the best thing you can do is get out of the way. And I think we're starting to see this in our management structure. So we've built over time these gigantic management structures. Here's the king of the world on top. He's got 2 lieutenants. The 2 lieutenants have 8, generals. The 8 generals have, and it cascades all the way down, right? And what happens is it takes years to get anything done, right? Because I don't have the authority to do that. I don't know. I have to check with this. Not my job, not my title, not my department. I mean, if you've been in big organizations, you've heard all those phrases and wanted to punch somebody in the face when they were your roadblock. And I think what you're starting to see is you're seeing companies start to form that minimize that structure. And the minute that they add that structure back in, they lose their good people. And Google ran relatively flat for a number of years. They started to get bigger and bigger. They had to start putting more and more structure. They felt they had to start putting more and more structure back in place. Most of the VPs of Google tend to be leaving for Facebook now. Why? Because their bosses stopped trusting them. They stopped allowing them to be creative. They started putting roadblocks in their way. Something to think about. Best thing you can do is get out of the way of good people. So why so serious? This is another problem that big organizations have, is we're so concerned about a reputation, so concerned about pomp and circumstance, so concerned about legal issues, so concerned about covering our ass that we forgot how to innovate. Right? That sounds like a great idea, but I'm worried what is, Joe Schmo, Joe Plumber think, and, we could maybe get sued if we go down that idea and maybe somebody else has a patent. And I don't want to trivialize those issues. But as a society, if we really want to move forward, we have to stop that kind of thinking. And we have to start saying, maybe it's time to be a little bit dangerous. Why do we have to be so serious about everything? Right? So anything I can do, you can do better. No, you can't. This is kind of the excellence piece, right? I think that's a big part of being driven towards innovation. I think everybody's capable of being creative. Not nearly as many people are capable of executing because they're poor collaborators, or even when they collaborate, they're not very good at bringing a product to market or basically realizing the dream, so to speak. A lot of people dream, not a whole lot of people live their dream. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the lack of excellence. And so, to me, it's about getting the right people in the room. So kind of coming back, full circle, I'll tell you a little story about like a day in the life of that I recently read, so I might get it wrong. So this is going on the internet. I apologize if I get it wrong, but I think it's pretty close to right. And who here's heard of Netflix? Right. Okay, so the way Netflix started is the CEO of Netflix rented a couple movies. Embarrassingly, he's kind of like me, a little bit. Prioritizes his life to where returning movies is probably not the top of the food chain, and they probably sat in his car for 40 days and he kept driving by and going, oh yeah, I really need to do that, but I don't have time. By the time he turned them into Blockbuster, he had a movie that cost him $40 in overdue. He was really, really pissed off about it. What you can do? $40. Want to keep renting movies, so I'll pay the $40. And he leaves. The whole way there. So some stimulus, right? Pain point. He doesn't have any idea. He's not thinking about creating the Netflix. Just had an interaction. One that pissed him off. Usually the best way to spark creativity is be pissed off about something. Right? So he's driving, and the whole way he's driving, he is just really frustrated and saying, man, this is just... I can't believe it's like criminal that they could do this. They can charge $40 for something that only costs $9. I mean, I could just buy him a new one for $9. This is ridiculous, right? And so a day or two later, right, so not instantly, he's in the gym. He's on the treadmill. And he's still pissed off about the Blockbuster DVD. He's like me, probably home. Probably got chewed like, hey, I put those in the car. How come you didn't return those? I told you 4 times. You told me you did, whatever, right? And so as he's sitting there on the treadmill, he starts to think. And he starts to really let the gears go. He starts to think, man, how come Blockbuster can't be more like my gym? And I could just pay like $30 a month, and I could just check out the movies that I wanted and return them when I wanted. And just like the gym, if I don't use the treadmill for 60 days, like I don't get charged more. Right? Or if I use the treadmill every day, I don't get charged more. And so he kind of thought about it. A little bit later, who's now, I believe, one of the VPs of Netflix. I went to lunch with him and said, hey, I've been thinking about this. God, now they're kind of Blockbuster. You're trying to get $40 for a stupid DVD. And I'm just thinking, does it have to be that hard? Well, couldn't you do, videos? And I'm sure he was met with all sorts of resistance. I'm sure, it was one of these, well, you can't compete with Blockbuster. They're huge. They've got thousands of locations. They've got all this inventory. The movies, whatever. And I'm sure he had to chew on that. And he had to keep sharing that idea with people to the point where it became, let's run some numbers on that. And I'm sure part of the number running came into, well, there's no way we can go procure that many stores and compete with Blockbuster. It would take, half a decade to get that many locations up and running. And I'm sure somebody interjected and said, well, CDs are pretty cheap. Could you mail them? And I'm sure they went through a whole other cycle of, Okay, what are the challenges with mailing them? UPS is too expensive, and FedEx, and do we insure them? And it kept iterating into that cycle until they got what we have now, which is Netflix. Pretty successful, pretty innovative business, one that's looking to now deliver movies in real-time streaming to mobile devices. And I can pull out my phone and I can watch a Netflix movie right here today. It costs me $9.99 a month. Pretty evolutionary if you ask the MPAA what they think about that. Kind of fucked with their business model. Kind of made them say, holy crap, what do we do? Right? So it started with a hunch. Started with a catalyst. Right? Started with stimulus. Turned into a hunch. Hunch was mulled over. It was shared. It was reprocessed. It was shared. It was reprocessed. It was shared. And was turned into. Talk about fun. Talk about excellence. I don't know if you're familiar with some of Netflix's HR policies. They don't have a vacation policy. The vacation policy is if you ask your teammates if you can go on vacation and not impact the team, and they say okay, you can go on vacation. Right? You look at Tony Hsieh with Zappos, right? Come to work for him. He's going to give you 2-3 weeks, and he's going to offer you 2 or 3 weeks worth more pay if you'll quit today. Why? Because he believes that he's offering an environment that people want to work in. And if they don't, he doesn't want them there. Because he understands you take nothing else away, it's all about people. Everything I've stated here is it's all about people. And it's about trusting them, it's about empowering them, and it's about giving them an environment to make the most out of who they are. And that is the evolution. Is when we start to get to a point where we're letting people be who they were wired to be, giving them the infrastructure to improve, and getting out of their way, will evolve. And so with that, go forth and prosper. I would love to see us in Mars before I die. I would love to be able to take a weekly vacation on the moon before I die. I hope my grandkids get to see Pluto and beyond. And that's not going to happen unless we get to a point where innovation is accelerating at a point much greater than it is today. So a couple of resources, and I'll post a slide deck somewhere and I'll give Mary the link.